In this video, we're going to take a look at masking materials using ID maps and the Polygon fill tool. Alright, so to start, we're going to need a new material. So here in my layer stack, I'm going to create a fill layer. And here for, let's target our ambient occlusion. I don't want this information to kind of pass through to this fill layer, so I'm going to set the blend mode here to normal, and I'm going to do the same thing here with my height. So we'll set the blend mode here to normal. Okay, so this is going to be the base of a metal material that I'm going to create. So let's just come down here to our material, and for this base color, I'm going to drop the value here just a little bit. And for the roughness, we'll come back to that here in a second, but for the metallic value, let's set this all the way to 1. So now here you can see that we're getting this metallic looking surface. Now for the roughness, I'm going to add a grunge map in here. So I'll click the button, and here in my mini shelf, I'm doing a search here for grunge and rough, and I've got these 3 maps. I like to use this grunge, rough, dirty, so I'm going to use this guy. So now what I'm going to do is come over here to the fill projection setting. We're going to switch this here to triplanar, and then just play around with the scale a little bit. So I'll probably do something like this here. Now, here with the layer selected, I want to process some of the ranges here in this roughness map. So instead of just using the balance control, I'm actually going to use a levels. So to do that, here I have the layer selected. We're going to add an effect, and we're going to add a levels. So for the affected channel on this levels, just like we have this channel selector here, I can choose an affected channel that I want this levels operation to target. So here I'm going to choose my roughness, and now the histogram is now showing the roughness channel, which if we go back to our layer, here we have a grunge map applied. So here back at this levels, I'm just going to play around with my output black and white to get the value that I want here. So I'm going to go with something more like this here. Alright, so now I'm going to take this layer, I'm going to right click, and I'm just going to duplicate the layer, and we're going to rename this here to edge. And then all I'm going to do is come over here to the base color value, and I'm just going to lift the value to get a much brighter color. And then we're going to mask this so that we can concentrate this brighter value just on the edges. So right click, add a black mask. Here with the mask selected, we're going to add an effect and a generator. And then here for the generator, I'm going to add the mask editor. So here, I'm just going to scroll down, and for my curvature, I'm just going to set this all the way to 1, and I'm probably just going to work with it as it is here. So not going to do a lot of crazy control here. Actually, take that back. I want to do one thing. I'm going to come down here to my texture input, and I'm going to add a little variation here with the texture. So let's grab this texture, and here I'm going to do a search for, let's see, what I'm looking for is grunge scratch. And I'm going to use this one here, grunge dirt scratched. So we'll enable that texture. Now, in order to visualize this, we need to just come all the way up here to the texture tab where we have the texture slider. And at a value of 0, it's basically turned off. So I'm going to slide this all the way here to 1. And then I'm going to come in here to the texture settings and switch this blending mode from overlay to max lighten. So now I'm getting something like this. Although I think using this texture as it is, well actually here, let's turn on triplanar, so that'll help with the seams that we were getting there. And then here with the texture, instead of keeping this all the way at 1, I'm just going to back it off a bit. So let's do something like, close to, let's do 0.5. Alright, so this is going to create for me a material that I want to use. This is just going to be a metal material, and I have these 2 layers here. So let's just group this so we can make a smart material out of it. So we'll create our folder here, and let's just call this metal rough. And let's take our 2 layers here. So shift left select both of these guys, and then I'm just going to drag and drop them here into this layer group. Now, again, as you'll see, all of a sudden, all of our height information from the layers below are now passing up here through this group. Now, I did set my heights blending mode for each of these fill layers to normal, but since I've placed this in the group, you can see that the group itself also has the blending mode. So for height, the blending mode is set to linear dodge by default. Here, I just need to set that to normal again. And let's make sure we do that with our ambient occlusion. Okay, so now we are good to go. Now that we have this material, we want to be able to mask this. And the first way we're going to talk about this is by using our ID map that we baked at the very beginning of the course. So to use that, I'm just simply going to right click, and we have an option here called Add Mask with Color Selection. So I'm going to choose this, And what this does is it creates a mask and automatically adds the color selection effect here in the mask. Also, the ID mask that's placed here, if I look at my texture set settings, for this texture set, we have an ID map, so that ID map is automatically added here to this color selection. Now, to create the mask, all I have to do is, for the colors, use the Pick Color button, and then I can choose which color ID I want this metal to be associated with. In my case, I just want to use this green color. And so here I've selected it, and now just like that, we have a mask. So I'd also like the rust to be used here, or have rust on top of this metal. So since we created our rust in a group, and that group is where our mask was created, we can simply just take this rust material and drag and drop this here right above the metal rough material. So we'll place this here at the top of the stack. However, we are getting a little problem here. If I zoom in close, you can see that the rust here just looks a bit too dark. Now, what's happening here is when I created this rust, I didn't use a metallic channel. And looking back on it, that was probably a mistake, because now I have to go and do a little bit extra work to fix it. So what's happening here, if we look at this, if I hit the C key on the keyboard, let's toggle through our channels so we can get to our metallic channel. You'll notice here that in the metallic channel, we have, well, that metal rough is now accounting for this white here in our metallic map. However, since rust is not metallic, and here you'll notice that our rust material is not being accounted for here in our metallic map. It should actually show as a black value. Well, to fix that, all we have to do, let's just come back over here to that base layer that's part of our rust. And what I should have done from the start here on my material, even though that this is a dielectric material, it's not metal, I should always just enable the metal channel here and just set its value to black. Now you can see that the rust is appropriately being accounted for here in my metallic map. If I hit M on the keyboard to go back to my material mode, we can now see that the rust color is rendering correctly. All right, so like I said, we have this metal rough, and we'd probably like to use this again in some of our other texture sets. So what I'm going to do is right click, and I'm going to create a smart material out of this. So now I'm going to come over here to my texture set list, and I'm going to enable this glass enclosure piece, because this is where I'm going to use some more of that metal texture. And here, let's use our keyboard shortcut to navigate to that texture set. So again, that's Control Alt, right click on the mesh part to select the texture set. We will go back here to our shelf. Let's grab this metal rough, and let's just drag and drop it here into our layer stack. So now I'm going to close my shelf, and let's take a look at this metal rough material. So here, if I go into my color selection, I just need to pick the appropriate ID color. Now, when I built this model, if I would have used the same color value for all these different texture sets to represent metal, it would have automatically worked. But in my case, I used different color values. So what I'm going to do here is just use my pick color again. And here, in this particular case, I want the yellow ID to represent the metal rough color. So we'll just left click on that ID. And now we've applied this metal texture here. Now, just as we did before, we want the rust to still appear over top of this metal. So all I need to do is take my rust material, left click, and drag and drop that right above the metallic rough material that we had created. We still have that same problem. So here with the rust, I'm going to go back to its base fill layer and just enable that metal channel. So now we have the rust rendering correctly over top of this metal material that we've created. So next, we're going to need to create a material here for the wick. So I'm going to just Control Alt right click just to make sure that I'm on the correct texture set. And then we're going to come in here and create ourselves a fill layer. Now, since we're talking about here, let me undo that fill layer. Since we're talking about in this texture set, and let's just solo this glass enclosure piece. So right now we have a single layer stack, and within this layer stack, we're actually looking at creating a couple different materials. So you'll notice here that I have this rust material, which has been grouped into this folder group. And then we have this metal rough, which has also been grouped into this folder group as well. And then we have this instanced layer stack here for this painted metal. Now, whenever I have a single layer stack like this and I want to have multiple materials represented here, what I always do is just create myself a folder and start building within this folder group. So here I'm just going to call this wick. And so this is going to be our wick material. Now, let's take this fill layer and drag and drop that here into the wick material, and let's enable that fill layer. Okay, so right now, the fill layer is overriding everything in my layer stack. Here, let's name this base, because it's the base level of the material. And what we need to do now is go in and mask. So we've seen how we can mask using the mask with color selection. So now I want to show you how we can mask using the Polygon Fill tool, which is actually a really handy, quick tool for masking. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose to create a black mask. And within this mask, I am going to create a paint effect. Now, I've said before, we could just have the mask selected and we could use the Polygon Fill, or we could paint right here. But I always like to create a paint effect here because it just gives me a quick way to toggle this off, or I could just simply delete the paint and start over if there's a mistake or something like that. So now that I have this set here, I'm just going to double click this and call this mask because I know this is going to control my masking. So now we're going to come over here to the toolbar and I'm going to enable the Polygon Fill tool, which is this tool here. Now, with this tool selected, you can see that the wireframe is now drawn over top of my mesh. If I come over here to my display settings, here under viewport settings, here you can see the wireframe opacity, so we can control this. And if I would like, we could also set ourselves a color. So maybe green is going to stick out a little bit more here. So let's change that. All right, so let's zoom in here to this wick area, and we have our mask and we have the Polygon Fill tool enabled. Now, here for the fill modes, you have a couple options. You have triangle and you have polygon fill. I'm going to say right off the bat that these two modes are not very useful, so I don't ever really use them. If we had polygon fill, what I could do with the color set to white is I can actually just click and drag to select a range of polys. But there's some issues with this tool as it stands right now. So you'll notice if I come over here to the back side, the selection is going all the way through and it can cause problems. So I'm just going to undo that. You can see that it was also projecting over here onto some of the wire. So like I said, I don't typically use this Polygon Fill tool. Now, the two modes that are very useful is this one here, which is the mesh fill or the UV fill. So since I know this is a separate mesh part, I can select mesh fill. And with the value set to white, I can simply come over here and just click here on this mesh part to fill that mask with the white value. So here, if I just Alt left click on the mask, we can see the mask that's been generated for me. I'll hit M to go back to my material mode. So let's say that this wasn't multiple mesh parts. It was just a single mesh, but that part of the mesh was broken up by UV shells. I could then use the UV chunk fill tool. Now I need to make sure that I'm on the mask here. So let's set this here to black, and then we're just going to left click, and now you can see that it just removes or fills the mask here, our paint effect, with the black value here for the mask. That again is based on the UV shell. Now I could jump over to my 2D view and select the UV shell from there as well, or I can do it here in the 3D view. So in my case, like I said, I'm just going to use the object fill. I can use the keyboard shortcut X to quickly toggle to this white value, left click, and now I have my mask. So that's how you use the Polygon Fill tool, and like I said, the most useful options is the mesh and the UV chunk tool. Okay, so now that I have that, we'll just click the brush to go back to our brush. Now, here on our group, we need to make sure that our height, see our height's now being passed through, so I want to come over here and just set that blending mode to for height to normal. And I'm going to do the same thing with the ambient occlusion, just as we've been doing in the videos so far. So now we'll just set that back to base color so I can see my thumbnails. And so now we have this material masked and ready to go. So here on this base, what I'm going to do, let's go to our material and let's set the roughness all the way close to 1 here. So this is going to be a completely rough surface. Now for the height, I want to add a map in here to control the pattern. So I'm going to click the button, and here I'm going to do a search for fabric. And we have some fabrics here. The one that I'm going to use is going to be this fabric alternate V. So I'm going to just left click to select this. And then here I have an option for the tile. So I'm just going to start to tile this. And let's go over here to our material. I'm going to leave this one on UV projection, and then I might just adjust the tile here as well. So let's keep it around, 4.1 or so. Now it's pretty intense, so while I'm on the fill layer, I'm going to target the height channel, come over here to my opacity, and then just lower the opacity down so I get something like this here. It's going to give me this fabric pattern here for this wick. Now I'd also like to create some ambient occlusion for this. So what I'm going to do with the layer selected, we'll click this add effect. Let's add a filter. Here for the filter button, we'll scroll down and we're going to use again our horizon-based ambient occlusion. And it's pretty intense here, so let's just drop the radius down. Maybe something like that. Again, I'm still targeting that height channel, so I might want to drop this value down a little bit more as well. Okay, so let's go with something like this. Now I want to look at colorizing this. So just to show you a couple more filters and techniques, I'm going to come over here to my material. Now for the material color, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here to my mini shelf, and I'm going to start a search for gradient. And here I have this linear gradient 1. I'm going to use this. And here you can see that it's starting to produce this gradient here for us. So now that I actually have some gradient value here on this base color, I'm going to use a new filter. So with the fill layer selected, let's go to Add Effect, and let's add a filter. Let's click our filter button, and then here I'm going to use this gradient tool. So I'll select the gradient tool, and this is going to give me a gradient system that I can use to define different color positions. Now in my case, I only want to use 2 positions. It defaults to 3, so let's set this here to 2. And here for the second color, I'm going to set this to like a black value. And for the first color, I'm going to set it here to something more like this, like a kind of a brownish yellow, something like that. And now I can start to just play around here with these color positions. So I want to push kind of the dark value up here towards the top, and I'm just using the gradient position slider to kind of do this for me. So here is kind of what we're getting with this. So now we kind of have this burnt coloring here towards the top of the wick. And the last thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a paint effect to this. So here we're going to add a paint effect. Now this is a fill layer, so like I've said before, we can't paint directly on a fill layer, but we can add a paint effect to this. So with that in place, let's come over here to our shelf and my brushes. I already have my dirt brush enabled. And let's come over here to the material for this, and just select kind of a dark value here. And now I'm going to go in here and just start to just paint just a little bit of just kind of randomness here on this edge like this. Something like that. Let's just move around to the back side. You can see I'm just moving my light so I can see what I'm doing. And here we go. All right, so when we zoom out on this, let's move our light. You know, I think that I just went a little too crazy with that. So here I'm just going to grab my eraser, and I'm just going to erase some of this out. So maybe I'll just do a little something like this here. Okay, so that's going to take care of the wick. Now, I actually forgot to apply our metal here to the handles that I have, so let's do that really quickly. So Control-Alt, right-click here on this handle piece, and let's open up the shelf. I'm going to come over here to my Smart Materials. Here's that metal rough. Let's drag and drop that here into the layer stack. Here we are going to do the same thing where we need to target our color selection. So we're going to come over here to our color selection. Let's choose the pick color, and again I'll choose the yellow. Okay, so now let's take our rust and let's just place that here above our metal rough. And once again, let's go back here into the group here for that rust. Select the fill layer, and let's just make sure that we enable that metal channel. So that'll take care of that handle. And let's come up here towards the top. Here's another handle. So Control-Alt, right-click here to select that group. Same thing. Let's grab the metal rough here from our shelf. Let's place the rust material on the top. Let's go into, well, while we're here, let's just go into the rust layer. Let's grab that fill, enable the metal channel, and then here for that metal rough, let's go into the mask, color selection, pick color, and let's choose the yellow ID. All right, so that's going to close out this video. Here we looked at using the color selection tool to use the ID mask that we bake using the integrated baking system so that we can associate an ID with the material. Again, just quickly create a mask. We also talked about using the Polygon fill tool, using the Polygon and the UV chunk option so that we can either click a mesh part or we can click a UV shell to create the mask for us as well. In the next video, we're going to finish out all of the materials by taking a look at creating an overall dirt as well as our glass.